So it's my great pleasure to be able to speak today with Joachim Froese, who's one of the artists in the exhibition, and we're sitting in front of his works here. So Joachim's a photographer, and he's a photographer who it's very apt to have in this very first section of Harvest, which is called Objects in Circulation, because he really epitomises the kind of contemporary artists that we see today. So born in Canada, and he grew up in Germany and moved to Australia, to Tasmania originally, and now he spends his time between Brisbane and Berlin. So it's really, it's a wonderful contrast when you think about the circulation of contemporary art in the world today, and contemporary artists who have a global outlook and really a global address, if you like. I might just start in the very beginning, if you don't mind, Joachim, and we'll talk about these first works, and just about actually let's just begin with your interest in art history and why it was the still life that interested you.
The reason why I came to still life, to the paintings of still life, it was the realism in the paintings. And I did my master's in 2000 and 2001 at Queensland College of the Arts, and I began very much to look at these pictures for their realism. For example, when you see the QAGOMA on the other side, it's the first time, or not the first time in art, but it's really when realism becomes almost photographic. And that was the initial interest I had when I looked at these pictures. The next thing which interested me was the idea that artists moved around, not just the works moved around and the product moved around, artists moved around as well. And that reminded me very much of my immigration to Australia, because I came to Australia in 1992 and I felt very much like a migrant. So I started to look at the work that was made on the boats by the artists. And so from my immigration through the realism and the still lives, I actually ended up looking at these things. And the next thing that struck me was that while they were showing realistic images and realistic objects, there's a strong symbolism in all of these works. And I began very much to become interested in that, because I think we all make a statement with images, and we all make a statement with art, and it doesn't have to be political art to be political in a sense. So I began looking at the still lifes, initially at the Baroque still lifes from the Dutch period, from the Netherlands. And when we look at the QAGOMA on the other side, we can actually have a very good example, and it's
I'll just point, Joachim, I'll just point out to you, everyone, that the painting that we're talking about is the one second from the left on the bottom. So it's an Alexander Korssmann from circa 1650 from the collection. So it's a really beautiful example of the Flemish still life, which is really is a conversation about the abundance of produce and about about wealth, essentially a burgeoning middle class type of wealth. So you have these the merchant class, and they're suddenly becoming influential and affluent enough to commission artists, and they want that represented in their home. They've got they're producing and they're acquiring products, and so you see that the sort of literally tumbling out of these beautiful paintings, which would have been seen originally in domestic settings, and they're showing everyone, they're showing their friends. They're really, they're aspirational paintings in a sense.
Exactly. And what we also must know about the tradition of the still life paintings in the Netherlands, the Flemish still life tradition, is that it was a reaction to the Spanish occupation, and because the Netherlands were occupied by the Spanish crown, and they fought an 80-year war to get independence. And coming back to these works now, they are actually not looking so much at the Dutch still life tradition, but they're looking at the Spanish still life tradition, at the bodegones, how they're called. And these works were had a complete different flair, a complete different outlook on the world compared to the Dutch, because, and unfortunately we haven't got any examples here, but very briefly, the Spanish still life tradition is a very geometric one, and it's rooted in Catholicism and rooted in peasant life. So the Spanish still lifes show peasant food. Often they show stuff the locals ate, consumed, while the Dutch still lifes often showed exotic fruits.
Yeah, that's right. I'm not sure if there is anyone in the crowd who came to our Spanish show, the Prado show, but there was a beautiful room of still lives, and that's the kind of works we're talking about. So as opposed to these sort of really lush images, these very Baroque images, they're very dramatic, and you have all these kind of glistening grapes falling out, literally falling off the table. The Spanish still life tradition is it's very austere by comparison. These very beautiful, very simple, and they're very earthy. So you see these kind of often root vegetables. Foods you can imagine that they're growing in their little kitchen gardens, and they've come out and they've been put into their pantries. Very lovely, very simple, a very similar aesthetic to Joachim's photographs here. So you can really see that particularly Spanish aesthetic, Joachim's work.
Exactly, and the background of these works is too that I produced them. They started to work on them in Barcelona when I got an Australia Council residency in 2002, and there's a fantastic residency in Barcelona, and my partner and I, we were 3 months in heaven, living in one of the best cities in the world, being able to study the tradition of these still lives. And that's where the the top picture was actually produced. The other two, the middle and the bottom one, they were produced in Brisbane when I came back. So, but I find the whole idea of the tradition of still life super interesting, because I think we can learn so much from that tradition. We can actually learn that you can say a lot with little things, and I think objects are a quintessential meter of our life in a way. We are surrounded by things, and the things that surround us say so much about our lives, and especially when you look at politics and you can really see the struggle between Protestants and Catholics, Spaniards and Netherlands.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and it's also the first time that these sort of very simple products and objects become the centrepiece and become those symbols of paintings. So remember, before this, we're looking at either really overtly religious imagery, painted primarily probably to be seen in churches and chapels, and also history paintings, so big kind of dramatic, really essentially propaganda for the royal families, and of course royal portraits. So you really start to see these kind of simple objects appearing, and they become very important, you're right, very important symbols in their own right, which leads me to the title of your work, which I think people might be interested to know, repography. So it's not a term that I'd actually come across before, so I'd really be interested to hear you to talk about why you called your works that, and where that's come from.
I first came across the word in the writing by Norman Bryson. He wrote a famous book on the still life, looking at the overlooked, and one chapter is called actually repography. So that's where I first came across the word, and it's derived from the Greek word ropos, small wares, little objects, trifles, and it stands in opposition to the big themes like history painting and portraiture, the megalography, the images of big things. So repography are the images of small things, and immediately it struck me because it sounds so much like photography. It was in a way the perfect word I was always looking for when I was thinking about the title. It made direct connection between the still life paintings and the photography, and it is actually a word that was used in the 19th century. So Norman Bryson didn't make it up. It is an old-fashioned term for still life painting.
So is art theory, and I assume it is a large part of your work?
I can't separate it. I can't separate my work from art history and art theory. It's Papa George, he's a famous teacher of photography in the United States. He says, if your photographs are not good enough, you don't read enough. I really think you have to know what you are making pictures of. Well, I wanted to say what you're talking about. to me, my work process is very much I read, and then that triggers an idea, and I go back to the studio, and an idea is in my head, and then I look for the visuals, and vice versa. Then I work on the visuals, and automatically, that triggers another idea, and I read up on it, and I read up on current theory, but everything to me is rooted in art history. All my inspirations come from these old paintings, and
So when we do think about painting, and particularly when we're thinking about 17th century still life, not only are these sort of loaded, these objects become loaded with meaning, but it was also a way for people to demonstrate their skills as painters. So it was a way of selling yourself, which makes the history of still life very much about painting. And, that tips over into the modern period when it becomes about, we've seen curator Ellie Buttrose put the abstract works, and so it really is, that's really a history of painting and looking as a painter. So how does photography, as a photographer, or why photography, I should say, and
why photography is simply because I'm a photographer first and foremost. I mean, I'm trained as a photographer, and some people tried to teach me drawing. It wasn't very successful. I am a photographer since the age of 6. My father came and gave me the first camera, which was a little plastic happy snap camera, and ever since I've taken pictures. Long time as an amateur, as a happy snapper, and eventually I went to art school to give it a solid base. But the reason why photography fascinates me, put it this way, is because it is this bridge between the real and the concept, much more than painting in a way is, because if I photograph a tree, I need the bloody tree, I mean, I can't draw it and invent it. So, but at the same time, it shows my ideas about the tree. I mean, if you give a camera to 3 people, they will come up with 3 different photographs of the tree. So, it is very important to me that people realize or know that photography is, in a way, a construction. And in a way, as much as painting. For example, when I teach, I always give the example of the Christmas dinner. I mean, it can be the worst Christmas dinner in history. Everybody's fighting and everybody is cranky with each other. Out comes the camera and everybody smiles, And there is no Christmas picture in the world that shows cranky people, because we're all supposed to be happy and lovey-dovey at Christmas. So even when we put up our pictures on Facebook, we all construct the world around us, and very much the image how we want to be seen. And when you look at the Dutch still lifes, they are paintings which show how societies want to be seen.
Yeah, that's very true. There's no doubt that photography, a large part of it is about editing and editing out what you don't want in there. So the idea that the photograph never lies is a very loose one.
A lie.
But yes, no, and I see your point. I mean, if they'd had cameras back in the 17th century, I'm sure a lot of these still lives would have been photographed, because they were trying to create the optical illusion that it was real, that you could put your hand in there and pick them out, which is that beautiful quality that you get from photography.
And actually, a lot of the Dutch still life painters used cameras. They used the camera obscura. Vermeer used the camera obscura. The Dutch invented the lens, and it was, especially with the Dutch still life painters, it was often a hidden secret that they were not allowed to talk about, because at the time the lens was regarded as distortive and a devil's tool. But it's now pretty much proven that at least a large majority of them looked through the camera and actually used the camera obscura. It was just that at the time there was no medium to fix the image.
Yeah, that's right. There was probably a feeling too that there was in a way, it was cheating to have that device,
exactly,
but of course it wasn't. And you get all those really beautiful, you get all that wonderful sort of geometry and symmetry, and particularly works like Vermeer. I wonder if you just talk to that, because that's another artist who I can see in your work, that very sort of precise, almost scientific in a sense, or mathematical. There's a certain, they're very beautifully placed. There's not that that feeling of, often with photography, and particularly when you look at 20th century photography, what really rose to the front was the idea that the camera was the perfect tool to capture those fleeting moments of modernity. So those kind of, the decisive moment, the classic quote. So, but you use the camera in a way that it's almost like it's a microscope that you're going in for those details.
It's definitely a microscope for me because it's macro photography, so you've got special lenses, special tools to go really close. So like you can show a little seed of pumpkin, a pawpaw seed, really, you know, in a size which you normally don't see it. The way I work is actually quite a painterly one in a funny way, and there is a tradition of, there is a lot of photographers who copy the look, the painterly look of images, and a lot of photographers have played with that idea. For example, Ansel Halka made this series of Dutch interiors with people which they look very painterly. And I deliberately didn't want to have a painterly look. I actually wanted to have a very photographic look. But one of my the hallmarks of my work, or one of the major features, in most cases anyway, is that I interrupt the image. And when you look at the images you see, they are actually made of separate, not just separate photographs, actually separate negatives. And this is all done analog back then. And I literally photographed, if you look, best case, I quickly talk you through this picture. It's what looks like two pawpaws is in fact the same slice photographed 4 times. And I hacked into it over time, and I actually break up Cartier-Bresson's decisive moment, because there is 4 decisive moments in there, and they are very much staged. So what you see in my photographs hardly ever has been like that on the stage. So these 4 pawpaws are a complete illusion. Or these 2 pawpaws, because it is, this is the first image. Then I took a little brush and rearranged the seeds, photographed it again, flipped the image in the enlarger, then took a little knife, or a spoon I think it was, and hacked into it, photographed it again, and then hacked further into it. So there is this idea of time in there as well. And it is actually a deliberate move away from Cartier-Bresson's decisive moment, because again, it just implies that that decisive moment shows the world the way it is. But it's, again, I'm coming back to this idea that photography is a construction, and I could have done this digitally, but I actually want to show the breaks in my images to actually make people aware of the fact that these aren't seamless surfaces, these are actually constructions. And when I say I work quite painterly, it's, if I don't like the left, or the fig on the left, I actually, in a way, erase it, because I have a negative, which is an empty space. And if I don't like the fig there, I take it out, literally like somebody, you know, paints over something in a painting. So the whole idea and the way I approach these images is very painterly, although I absolutely want to stay in the photographic language, in the photographic look.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So then your more recent shift to colour digital photography wouldn't be a painful one, because you've got that ability to manipulate. Would that be a fair assumption?
Absolutely. I mean, the move from film to digital never was an issue for me ever, because I was actually trained as a graphic reproducer, and back in Germany when I did my apprenticeship in graphic reproduction, I was one of the first operators in digital image manipulation, when the hardware probably filled a room quarter of the size, and I knew Photoshop before it was invented. So the move into digital came for me at the same time when I moved into color, because I never was interested in color film photography, because I didn't like the papers, I didn't like the chemicals.
It's very dangerous, yeah.
It's very dangerous. The bloody things are unstable. And you could only manipulate the colors over all of the image. So for example, you can crank up the cyan and the whole photograph becomes more cyan. But with digital photography, you can now go into individual colors, and you can manipulate colors much, much finer. I also can now print on the same papers which I printed my black and whites on, which are actually fiber-based, and they're not these horrible plastic papers. So in 2006, I actually moved away from black and white, and at the same time I moved away from film.
Yeah. So maybe you could talk about there's not just that technical shift, but also your conceptual evolution. So over those years to the type of works that you're doing now.
Basically, after this, I'll bore you with a very brief rundown on my practice from there on. So basically, from here, I worked on another project which was called Species, and it shows little toys my daughter used to play with, and it depicts biblical scenes. And that was my last work in black and white. It was technically so crazily difficult that I really had enough of it. I started to spend weeks on one image in the studio, and I thought, this is ridiculous. I'm
becoming obsessive.
It was becoming obsessive, and I just had enough of it, basically. So, and in 2006, a few things happened. I buy a digital camera. I actually had enough money to buy myself a Canon digital camera, and at the same time, my mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and I got a call from an auntie saying, look, she was in Germany, and she said, look, if you want to see your mother alive, you better come over very quickly. So I dropped everything in Australia, moved over, and spent the last 6 weeks of her life with her, nursing her at home and then in hospital. And during that time, I photographed all the books she owned, and she had a massive library of around 1,000 books. And I photographed them in a long series of images, which is called Portrait of My Mother, and it shows all the books she had in a long row of books, 36 meters long. And it was very much my last conversation with her, my goodbye to her, and it shows not her face, not her liking at all, but it shows her spirit, what she was interested, etc.
That must have been a very different work for you to produce, coming from an emotional or a cathartic point of view rather than your theoretical or art history point of view, do you think? Or you approached it in the same way?
No, I didn't approach it in the same way, I think. Rapography, there is death and mortality in these images, and in particular in the dead insects which I photographed before, but I didn't have a bloody clue what I was talking about. And I think you really only realize what death is on a personal level. And this whole work changed my outlook on life, and it was actually a very easy work to make, because I didn't make it for the public. I actually had no intention to show that work at all. I simply made it to make sense of the situation for myself. In the evening, when my mother was in bed, I actually went to the studio and photographed the books, and it was my own little headspace to make sense of it. And only later, when the work was done, I showed it to some friends, and they said, you have to show this, you have to make it public. And I was at first actually rather reluctant. I'm really happy that I did it now, because it actually, the responses were quite amazing. And so it was a very easy work to make, in a way. But I don't want to talk about the bloody books forever. But next 2 years, I was still working through the mourning process. I made 2 more works about my mother's death and related thoughts and developments after that. And then I was in personal family history. All of a sudden, my work had shifted from the big themes, in a way, to my very own personal life. And another side effect of my mother's passing away was that I cleared out her drawers, and I found all the letters of my grandfather. He wrote from World War II. He was a German middle-ranked officer, and all of a sudden I read these letters, and that was the work I did in 2012, 2 years ago now. And I folded these letters as origami boats and photographed them as origami boats. And that's going to be a show in Berlin at the end of the year. So I was in the middle of, looking at my family history, at my private life.
Yeah. And maybe just to end, I might get you to talk about what you're doing now. I know that you're doing your PhD, and that you're interested in the topic of Renaissance garden design and the idea of cultivating nature and bending it to our whim, to the whim of mankind. So it's very interesting, and you also discuss Thomas Saraceno in your PhD, which is it's a lovely sort of beginning point and end point to this exhibition, but also to your practice. So perhaps I'll get you to talk about that.
No worries. I'm doing a PhD at RMIT University in Melbourne, and the theme is the Hortus Conclusus, the enclosed Renaissance garden. And I look at it, again, I look at Renaissance art, I look at these early modern images from the 15th century, which often show Maria in the garden, and actually, and Maria is the garden. So I'm not going to go too much into it. I look at it as a symbolic space of delimitation of nature. Basically, there is a garden which shows a domesticated nature, and the garden is cut off from the world around through a wall, and it actually separates sort of good nature, nature that's good for humans, from bad nature or
wild
nature, unimportant nature. So that idea I now take into the environmental debate, or I look at the contemporary environmental debate, and I look at very similar things Thomas Saraceno looks at, biotopes which are enclosed, and utopian concepts, how we can actually go on living on this planet. So to me, I haven't been as excited about something for a long time. It's really, I find it really interesting to read up on eco-critical theory, ideas about the mesh, which Thomas Saraceno talks about, that all ecological systems are interconnected and we are just one part of this interconnectedness, and I'm trying to find the visuals for it. Again, it's this old way of working of mine that I read and look at theory, and then it kicks off ideas, and there is actually, if it's not, there is if you want to see what I'm doing now, there is a little work, there is actually a big work hanging out in Fish Lane, which is just in the process of being installed by the Brisbane City Council. And what I do is, at the moment, I photograph seedlings. I photograph plant seedlings, I raise plant seedlings, and then put them in panels, not unlike the Bernhard Hiller-Becher works, who photographed lots of water towers and then put them up in panels. But panels,
so there's a very different thing going on between those works of those architectural constructions and then seeds and biology, do you think? Or you see a connection between those two?
I think no matter what area you work in at the moment, everybody looks at nature at the moment. And architecture does too. And I mean, Thomas Saraceno very much comes from an architectural direction, and that's a strong influence on him. And he talks about these floating cities and floating biotopes, and obviously art has got the amazing quality that it doesn't have to be built in reality. So it's always, to a degree, art is always utopia, which is also one of the topics, issues in this exhibition. So I think Thomas is a very interesting artist in that sense, that he actually gives us ideas what could be. And I think the role of art is not to find the answers. The role of art is to find a good question. And I think that's what art always does. That's what the art in the 15th, 16th, 17th century has done, and what art is doing now.
Yeah, that's true. That's the wonderful luxury that artists have, is that they don't actually have to get into the lab and prove their theories. They can just work through these ideas. So it becomes this wonderful melting pot of ideas. So I might throw it over to the audience, if Joachim doesn't mind. And does anyone have any questions at all about what we've talked about? Yes?
Thank you. I wondered whether you saw your photography as partly being in the tradition of German photographers, such as the Dusseldorf school of realist work.
Not heavily. Interestingly enough, there is a hangover at the Düsseldorf school that have open crits, and in 1994, I think it was, I went to one of these open crits at the Düsseldorf school when I was actually thinking I'm very much like them, or they're realist, so I went there, showed my work, which was completely different to this because it was early work, but they just shook their heads and said, no, you're not like us at all. So they didn't want to own up on me. So, but obviously they are an influence. I grew up with that stuff, and as an artist, and but there is other influences which I think are strong. I mean, Becher's more than the Struths and the Ruffs, but also I looked a lot in my early times at the new photography, Albrecht Rengerpatsch, and new ways of looking, new ways of holding the camera. It was all part of my making. I don't think I would be working in that tradition now. For starters, I mean, I'm way too constructed for them, and but I think you can't escape your cultural heritage, and that is very much my heritage. And obviously, I look at it a lot. Yeah, and the Bechers are very important for me at the moment because I think about typologies, think about panels, think about these grids, how they present their work, and that's probably, if the work is going where I'm thinking it's going at the moment, you will see some clear reference to that. But again, you know, I mean, it's in a way an influence like the Dutch still lifes, which aren't, you know, my work doesn't look like that. My work aren't the still lifes, but they work through some ideas which are also important to me.
The pawpaw is obvious, but could you explain what you've pictured in the top two?
The top two, the top is figs. So and the way I put it this way, these are just 3 out of something like 20 images, and I show them in various degrees of decay, and this is actually probably quite well preserved images, but there is some serious mold going on in other images. So the figs are actually, I let them sit in the sun for quite some time, so I deliberately wanted to have them beyond their best, and actually the one on the left is even further. You know, I hacked into it and I left it sitting there. So their figs, probably the freshest thing in the whole series is the fish here, and also it's interesting because it's the only thing, everybody says this looks really odd, but it's the only thing which actually looked the way it is presented, because that's how I get the fish bones when I make a fish soup. So they shove the tail into the mouth. So this was literally, you know, just that was the quickest image I've taken in all of the series, because it was just the time, it took me an afternoon to photograph it. And I also learned something about fresh fish and cooked fish, because there is some other fish bones which I photographed and they were cooked, and they do smell after 2 days. It was, well, fresh fish is bearable after 2 days. Cooked fish becomes a total alarm.
Would you be prepared to talk a bit about the symbolism of those 3 works? Because I think there's quite a lot in it.
Yes, the fish obviously is a symbol for Christ in religious painting, and I actually use Christian symbols. You have to also know that my main reference for these works is Juan Sanchez Cotan, the famous painter, the Spanish painter, was a painter and a monk. He was a Carthusian monk, and he depicted the works in a very geometric form in the Lada, the Spanish Lada, Cantarero, and I photographed these pictures. I picked up his idea about God's Lada and God's provenance 400 years after him, and while he shows his works really fresh, I deliberately let it pass away and let it go off. And in a way, it is a comment on me, by me, on how we deal with the idea of provenance and how many of these Christian ideas are actually valid today and how many are actually superseded. And I am an atheist, but I'm very much interested in the Christian symbolism. So the fish is a direct reference to the Christian symbolism, but generally the symbolism I try to put in there is this geometric rigidity which the Spanish still lives show so much. Oh, you've got.
I might just jump in there and add that in addition to the still lives being about wealth and abundance, of course, there was also the memento mori element to them. The idea that you might have this heaven on earth at the present time. So, but that we're all mortal. And so they were reminders that even though we were moving to, and it's still an incredibly religious culture, of course, in the 17th century, but you're moving to a more secular domain, certainly more secular art, but that there was always that reminder in there that these fruits and vegetables would rot, just as we would, we start our lives as being young and beautiful, and we get old and we die. So there was always that reminder in there, and that was always that religious element that remained in still life paintings.
There's also, again, this is just a small fraction of my work, that there is works which reference the Dutch still life tradition much more than the Spanish still life tradition. And if you look at the QAGOMA again, you see the platter, the silver platter, which is on this slope, and it literally looks as if all this wealth and beautiful stuff, with the richness of our existence, can come crashing down the table any moment. And there is other works where I actually pick up that trick and put things right on the edge of images, and so it shows the fragility of our existence. So a good idea is, if you want to copy artists, copy people who have gone 400 years, because then it's called appropriation, and it's perfectly fine to do it, So, for example, the strings, again, I stole from Cotán. It's not my idea.
I was just wondering, with still lifes, you tend to have a very deep depth of field because they want to show off everything and they want to make it all glowing and sort of glorious. You've got a very shallow depth of field in those images, and even beyond the focus, if you like, you've got light in the foreground and dark in the kind of negative space in the background. I just wondered, is that something that you're aware of in most of your work, or was it specific to this set of works?
Here we come to a fundamental difference between photography and painting. Photography is limited to optical rules and regulations, and one of the problems is when you do macro photography, your depth of field, the area which is sharp, shrinks dramatically. So the closer you go, the less you have of it. And I used all sorts of all the tricks in the book to actually extend as much as I can, but it is a very shallow depth of field. So I had to arrange things very carefully in that small slither of sharpness, and you can't do anything about it. So it does become a hallmark of my work, because a lot of it is macro photography. So it's always a very shallow depth of field. But I was actually quite happy, because again, I didn't want to copy the aesthetics of the works in the still lives. I actually wanted to deliberately use a photographic aesthetic, and that is the depth of field, the small one, is very much a part of that.
The Spanish still lives are very shallow. I just should say to you that the Spanish still lives have a very small depth of field. So if you have a look at the works by Cotán, who Joachim was referencing before, that everything is you'll have a black background, and everything's pushed very much to the forefront, rather than the Flemish or the Dutch still lives, which you're right, it's all about that kind of the world view almost, rather than those very small intimate views.
It's also part of that is also that the Spanish, especially Cotán, withdrew himself as an artist completely. I mean, he shows this larder is very much a ubiquitous space. It's as unsexy as it comes, and while the Dutch still life painters really wanted to show off their technical skills, Cotán, again, a monk, very restrained, withdraws himself as an artist almost completely. I mean, Norman Bryson writes in depth about exactly that, and it's something which really fascinated me too, and that's what I, in a way, wanted to have here as well, this austere marble. It took me ages to find a good marble slab which looked, which had my look. It actually took me ages to find a string which was looking good enough to use, because it's dental floss, and which actually isn't a nice round string. It actually has got the beautiful texture which I was after. So
Well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. So please join me in thanking Joachim and Sally for such a fantastic talk.